Welcome to the Gravity Well podcast with me, Jenny Yeremy. I host the Gravity Well to celebrate and share the stories of people looking to empower others with the knowledge and skills required to reestablish stability in our communities. My mission is to work through heavy issues in conversation and process in order to lighten the load. I acknowledge that I live on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 and Métis Districts 5 and 6. The treaties and self-governance agreements established by Indigenous peoples were created to honor the laws of the land, maintain balance with nature, and give back to uphold reciprocal relationships. This knowledge and intention are what guide the Gravity Well conversations. I ask for genuine dialogue, real hearts, and openness to different perspectives. This is your invitation to find common ground with me. Positions taken by participants, either individually or collectively, do not necessarily represent those of the Gravity Well. This podcast is dedicated to the natural world, our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and all future generations. The Gravity Well is on YouTube and streaming wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you see and hear, remember to like and subscribe.
Hi, Jenny. I'm so glad to have you today. I'm so honored to be on your show and honored that you're on mine. So let's just get into it. We have been lucky enough to continually be crossing paths for activism, I don't know, 15 years maybe.
Hmm. I'm fairly new to this space, I have to admit. I've only really woken up in 2022 was when I really had my moment and started joining the activist world. But I certainly have been following you. Have you been at this for 15 years, Michelle? Is that right?
I would say longer too. It's just that I'm sure you must remember that was like when Facebook first started. And a lot
Right.
of people started maybe having a Twitter account, maybe.
Mm.
And like there's been such an evolution in social media apps and activism. Back in, I don't know, more days, we were all on Facebook. We just weren't on each other's radar until the social medias. And then, for folks like yourself, who claimed to not be aware, I just know you were a community person, though, in general. Like you were paying attention. I would see you being out there in some capacity. And at that time, I felt like there was only David Swan who really cared
I
way back
can,
then when we
right.
had Dr. David Swan and we had Kent Hare, Darshan Khan, Bruce Payne. They were all in the legislature and they were talking about issues that mattered to me. And then Raj Sherman crossed the floor and I didn't really trust him because he was a conservative deep down. And just silly partisan politics. And at that time that was all we really had. So that's how I kind of remember that time way when we were still doing pride parades on Stephen Avenue for like 3 blocks with maybe 300 people.
Right. Yeah, what an evolution it's been in Calgary when I think about it that way, because you're right, it's been a slow trickle and now it seems like we are finally the floodgates have opened and we people like you and I have found each other and we're working together happenstance wise and deliberately in some cases. So it's just fabulous to see us finally connecting the dots and weaving our our activist lives together.
Yeah, 100%. Most recently, you've been really active with this podcast, The Gravity Well. Do you want to tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, I'd love to. I was in the oil and gas industry. I was working in liability. So I again fumbled into this. So I was a geophysicist, and as a geophysicist, you're focused on extracting. That is your job. You're an extractivist at the heart of it. And you're working very closely on that, and you're only focused on that. And quite honestly, any barrier to that is a problem. For example, landowners. First Nations, any Indigenous people on the landscape, they're holding us back from trying to do what we're trying to do. And in about 2012, or 2013, I should say, I was working for a company and we went to sell assets to another company. And that's when I really started looking at what we were selling. And I recognized that we were passing on something that was much different than what we were selling. I'll be specific. A lot of water gets produced with the assets that we were producing, and we weren't really accounting for that properly going forward. And that was my first sort of, uh-oh, if we're not doing that and it's not expected of us to do that, then every company is doing this because we thought we were doing work really well. We thought we were, best in class kind of thing. And so fast forward to 2020, I ended up working at CNRL. I was at one of the largest companies in Canada, and I was working for when the federal funds came in to help those sites get cleaned up. It was a dream come true. My job was to work with the government, the regulator, the industry, and First Nations, and it was all under the lens of reconciliation. We were meant to empower Indigenous communities to do this work, to get educated, to get jobs. And to me, it was just, I'm finally in a place where I'm going to be able to get us back on track, get us moving in the right direction. And that quickly came out from under me. So in 2022, I did a presentation to my peers about just this, about putting restoration first and empowering geoscientists to help lead this space. And the next day I was brought into a meeting room and removed my job was removed from me and I was written up in 4 different ways and I've pled constructive dismissal and I've been working on that fight ever since. So it led me to this. I noticed that there was a space where people were really not talking about restoration, not talking about this industrial complex that needs to be dismantled. And so I've just been trying to fill the void where I saw it was there. So that's what brought me to it. How about you,
Wonderful.
Michelle? Can you also help me understand what brought you into doing the Native Calgarian podcast?
Jenny, let me back up to the time you were in industry. I think it was 1990 something or other. I started working downtown for a seismic data company, and we sold QIs, quality inspections, to geophysicists like yourself.
This is
And
why we cross paths.
mhm. And then, I went back to SAIT and got myself some drafting under my belt. And I worked for survey companies that were drafting wells, pipelines, access roads for industry. And who did we work for? We worked for all of the companies you likely worked for. And that was the work we were all doing together. And of course, like you, I was not connecting why certain things were the way they were, other than just misogyny, right? Like to me, a lot of things, it was like, I think this leads us back to misogyny, not really understanding what colonialism was at the time. It really took the birth of my daughter and experiencing systemic racism at the Peter Lougheed for me to really understand what systemic racism was. And it was then I actually worked with Manmeet Bhullar, out of all people, the late Manmeet Bhullar, to get midwifery funded in Alberta, because at that time it wasn't. So May 5th is International Day of the Midwife. And my daughter was born in 2007, and in 2008, he got that covered finally in Alberta.
Wow,
So
amazing.
that's where my activism really started. And, working with him. And at the time, I just thought the world of Dr. David Swan, because he was very adamant that the coal mining was causing the asthma and the allergies that he was seeing in his family practice, and that we needed to start really talking about environmental issues in a serious way. So it felt like the natural fit for me at that time. And that's why I really, gravitated both towards the federal and provincial liberals at that time. And, just I was raised, you work within the system, even if it's harming you. So, but I also grew up in domestic violence, so I had way too much tolerance for unfortunate truths, and but the more I learned and started reclaiming who I was and understood the gravity of Canadian policies against Indigenous people, the more pride I started to have about being Indigenous, because my granny, my mother, survived things no human being should have to survive, and yet they did. And I'm here because of that tenacity, bravery, luck, however you want to say it. That really led me on a journey of I'm a voracious reader. When I was younger, I would escape into Nancy Drew novels and such and go to the public library and just read and read and read. And now that I've just been more recently diagnosed with ADHD, likely have autism too, I think. I realize that I'm just a voracious reader. And so I've been reading a lot about Indigenous issues. My book club's about to have its 10-year anniversary. So, and then the folks who were along that journey with me understood they need to do more action. So they started the Reconciliation Action Group. And so it's a, Indigenous and non-Indigenous group working together because what happens in industry, and unfortunately, you described it for yourself perfectly. The moment you start to kind of be a little more honest and truthful, you lose your job. And that's what happens to a lot of Indigenous people. So we just learn to shut up and not really be honest and play a racist trope in order to appease our boss, our manager, whatever that looks like, right, in order to survive this world. And so that's really, what I had learned that concept sooner as a little girl, grew up in domestic violence, a little girl who was told horrible things about Indigenous people her entire life. I just kept that as private and quiet as I could. I was never a proud Native until I got older and I had my daughter. And I didn't want my daughter to live in a world where she had to be ashamed of her indigeneity. So that's really how I started all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, it's having kids and especially in the world that we are in right now where it's getting worse. That I think is really what drives me and it appear obviously is what's driven you as well is I can't not try my hardest for my kids and to know that I will look back and know that I tried everything. There's no gaps that I left. But I wanted to touch on one other thing you said there, which is just so interesting because I felt it too, which is what, these concepts of colonialism and reconciliation. You're right. Like when I was given that job, I was like, great, this is what I'm doing. What is that? Right? Like these are truly, and even in the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, it's become really clear to me that it is, again, about the land and getting back to this relationship of the land. So why don't we move into, if you don't mind, the topic of our conversation today, which is to talk about the treaties and what they mean. So I will offer, as you were offering beforehand, my settler perspective of these terms. So let's start with treaties. So let's see what I can do as a definition. So the treaties to me are agreements. They're agreements made between people, but to acknowledge all the beings, all the all the life in an area, the relationships that we have with each other to maintain those relationships with the other beings and the way the land operates. So being specific, the treaties would have started between Indigenous communities. So there would have been treaties between communities to agree on, again, a sharing of resources and an insurance that those resources would have longevity. I guess I should also mention that I understand they are to consider 7 generations. So to consider, again, I've had Harley Bastine, who is he's passed away, but he was a Blackfoot elder, was explaining to me that we don't just think of 7 generations in terms of humans, we think of 7 generations in terms of all the species that are present. So it's a long-term understanding of balance between our actions on the land and our interactions together. So I'm going to stop there for now. How did I
That's
do?
great. That's a great way to start it. Actually, just to build on what you were saying about him, I don't know how he may be related to Dr. Betty Bastine, but I'm looking up at one of my favorite books, and it's about Blackfoot treaties and ways of knowing. And,
Mhm.
she tried to educate us all in that book about what treaty was prior to colonialism as what treaty is past colonialism and talking really just amplifying what you said in general, that it's treaties were made long before settlers ever came here between different indigenous nations. Now today I brought a whole bunch of my books about Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and Treaty 11. Treaty 7, sorry, not Treaty 6. I don't have a Treaty 6. That's what I was going to say. The Crown, at the time, the British Crown, signed it with the Indigenous nations. That's kind of an important conversation to have because, like, as of yesterday, Treaty 6 chiefs went over to England and had a meeting with King Charles and talked to him about coming over and giving him a special invitation on birch bark. It's beautiful. I shared it on TikTok. Um, and it has an invitation to come next year to celebrate the 150 years of the signing of Treaty 6. And that to us is a spiritual covenant. But of course, the British Crown and the citizens of Canada don't understand that that's a covenant, that's a spiritual attachment, right? So when we talk about 7 generations, we are talking about a promise that has been made within those 7 generations, well, four, three behind us, that we are bound by that, right? And that's a spiritual covenant. That's not a legal covenants. Now, legally, it is internationally. The problem with Canada and Canadians is that they don't understand that they're bound to that. And they're here. Canada exists by the grace of the British monarchy who made that covenant with the Indigenous people. I always get a kick out of the conversation of founding fathers. I mean, typically that's a US concept and construct, but Pierre Elliott Trudeau really tried to, reignite that imagination of founding fathers. And so we did do, starting in about the 60s, all these renaming things, which is hysterical because if you really look at some of the people we named things after, they were some of the most horrible people to Indigenous people, breaking that treaty that the British Crown had signed anyway. So it's a really interesting conversation to have, and it's been really highlighted recently here in Alberta because of the ignorance of a lot of people talking about treaty without knowing any of the history behind it. And I'm just going to give a plug out to the Blackfoot Crossing because they talk about treaty from an Indigenous point of view. Up to now, I would say the last 10 years, Canada has had the narrative on everything. Indigenous people, who we are, what treaties are, and they're actually wrong about all of them. So the thing about the Blackfoot Crossing is that it shows our relationship from our point of view, from our perspective. I want Canadians to imagine signing a treaty with cannons pointed at you and your people while you've already been starved by the very people who claim to want to share the land with you. That's an international relationship under duress from the start. It's not really something that we agreed to, and what Canada wrote down and what our elders said they agreed to are totally different things. We didn't even speak English at that time. But if you read those documents, they they act as if we did and we didn't. So the interpreter at the time was drunk. We have so many stories to tell you. You need to go to the Blackfoot Crossing if you want to learn more from an Indigenous perspective about what treaty actually is. And when we talk about treaty, kind of one of the bigger concepts that you hear nationally, and I don't like pan-indigenizing because we're, 634 distinct nations. We are all different. And I think every Edmontonian would be insulted to think that they somehow are the same as somebody from Montreal, Quebec, right? But we are pan-indigenized. But the concept that, as long as this land is, the grass grows, the rivers flow, and the sunshine comes in, well, we are having problems with water, and we are having problems with the air, and we are having problems with things growing because of industry really being unchecked and unaccountable for its harm that it has caused. And, I would argue we should be talking about 1930s. That was when arbitrarily, and I think we will win this in court, that it was decided that the province would somehow have jurisdiction over national resources. And,
Mhm.
that has been the source of the bigger problem of, lack of equity when it comes to revenue sharing and who owns what. So, like these really unfortunately ignorant Albertans that think they're going to separate somehow think they have rights to oil and gas resources that are here, and somehow think they have, access to all of the water sources, et cetera, et cetera. And ironically, this land is being poisoned by the very industry they think they're keeping. And that's just not true in any capacity. And so, unfortunately, for these folks who believe in separation, I really think they would be better suited to just pick up their things and move to a place that they think is better. And if they think the US is better, then that's probably where they should move.
Yeah, I really want to lean in on something that you just spoke about there because that is just so important and you're helping me understand something. When the resource ownership was transferred to the provinces, that's so essential, like you're saying, because it undermines those treaty agreements that were held above the provinces, had nothing to do with the provinces. And how that plays out from a colonial perspective, from a just the way we are operating today is the federal government puts out the laws and then the Alberta and other provincial governments undermine those laws. And those laws are being undermined from an Indigenous perspective too. So it's just so fascinating. And again, it really goes back to treaty. They are undermining the capacity of our earth to reestablish, resustain, regenerate, let's say, to keep up with the extraction that we're causing. And so the ultimate learning that I had when I was in the industry was land stewardship laws. So I want to speak a little bit about that because I think it ties into where we need to go. Like what does tr getting back into treaty? So would you say that's true, Michelle? When I say that we are not in treaty today,
Yeah,
right?
no, I would say they're absolutely broken. And even for myself, I think the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, where ultimately we just have rights to these lands. Canada's had 150 years of good faith that they've absolutely not done anything in good faith for 150 years. So I think as Indigenous people, we have every right to say you're done. The Westminster British system is done. But that said, I think that would lead to chaos and civil war with settlers. So I know that we have a good idea of how to do this in a better way, but racism is really hard for people to understand. And it's really unfortunate people didn't start doing that work like meaningfully in 2020, preferably beforehand, because had they, maybe they wouldn't be so afraid of Indigenous governance, but they are petrified we are going to kick them all out and throw them away. And because that's what, of course, they continue to do to us. As you know, as a geophysicist dealing with
Ah.
landowners.
Yeah, well, this is just it. So the learning I had, so in addressing climate change, let's set aside our relationships with the earth for just a half a moment. What's missing in that is the land. So, for example, carbon capture and storage is something that was being created, proposed as a solution for this continued development of fossil fuels. And in the meantime, like I said, I was introduced to land stewardship laws and I saw, wait a second, there's a way for us to understand the the balance of our disturbance on the earth and what it means in terms of the ability for biodiversity to survive. So one of the what they say is a keystone species is the caribou species. So if we know that our caribou populations are in check, then we know that that ecosystem is intact. That means that ecosystem is functioning. So one of the tools that we have as industrialists is to look to the landscape and say, okay, we know that we've scarred the landscape in this way, and so the way to fix that is to just remove it. It's not complicated. And but to your point, people look at that and say, oh, well, we can never make those decisions. But we have to make those decisions. And that's the part that I think is, we, like you said, people say, well, we can't give the land back. Okay, nobody, I don't think if we turned around and said, we're walking away, the land is yours, is enough. Because, as you said, there's a responsibility for all of us here. For me, as a geoscientist, I feel compelled to help inform this activity, this important need for us to be able to live here. Like, maybe I'll say something that I hear that and I'm curious what your response is to this.
Sure.
So I went up to it was wonderful. It was the first inaugural event for water it was held by the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan Nation. It was a brilliant weekend between scientists and Indigenous folks. And then what was kept saying was we're monitoring, and the monitoring is telling us this and that. And my stomach would just go in knots every time I heard the word monitoring. And then the other thing that I heard was access to traditional rights. And I understand this, but I understand it from a broader perspective, which is when we think about ecological health, to me, that is a capacity for us to be able to feed ourselves locally, to be able to live on the land locally and know that every year we're going to have the capacity to live here if we had no access to anything else. And I think that's the part that I think is missing from people's understanding of Indigenous rights. I think they think that Indigenous rights only apply to Indigenous peoples, and they don't understand that it really we need to think about ourselves as Indigenous peoples now, because quite frankly, I'm here and I have to be able to sustain myself and my kids' kids, et cetera, and that into the future. So that was a lot, but can you maybe weigh in on a little bit of what I'm saying in terms of the understanding of Indigenous rights and
Mhm.
how we should think about that as a settler,
Yeah,
maybe?
that sounds great. I wish that our treaty partners, settlers, understood that when we advocate for the land, when we advocate for the water, when we advocate for keystone species like the buffalo, we are literally trying to help the very people who live here.
Yeah,
So not just us, but everybody.
right.
And unfortunately, a lot of settlers really have that, and I call it anti-Indigenous bias, that it's not for them. And I see that. So, for example, the National Inquiry did a report for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it was queer centered. But I never hear women's groups or queer groups advocate for those 231 calls to justice when it would literally directly benefit them too, right?
Mhm.
That intersectionality is not understood. It's a, anti-racism bias. It's a racism bias in general. It talks endlessly. All of our reports talk about anti-racism training, which helps brown people, which helps black people. And it does help people who identify as white because it helps them decolonize their thinking about superiority, right? Let's
No,
talk
I
about the
think that's so
Athabasca
important.
First Nation, Chippewa Dene First Nations, because I just did a book with them called Remembering Our Relations. This book is actually about Canada deciding to impose national parks, specifically the Wood Buffalo National Park, right in the middle of their territory, not allowing them to do the very trapping and hunting of caribou and the migration of caribou that was allowed prior to. Buffalo were actually, transferred up north. So, we're talking about two keystone species coming together that this was so unnecessary. So, for anyone who doesn't really understand colonization, if you read more about national park building, which was really a way to continue to segregate Indigenous people from their land, from their resources, from their medicines, from keystone populations, then he'll understand a little more about what we're saying when we talk about that. I hope that really helps folks who are listening understand the gravity of that conversation. Like when we talk about allowing migratory animals to be able to roam the way they should, and we start putting like land bridges over top of road systems, like it's such a simple task. Long ago, in a galaxy far, far away, they used to make in Europe little the curbs were made with little roundabouts so that, general critters could be able to get water, right? Like it would pool and they would be able to access that water. And, like literally like a water bowl for dogs that we do organically at businesses and such. Like it was just a part of the infrastructure. So I wish, like in a magical place where people actually work together and are not there for political gain, I just think of infrastructure being done so differently so that
Mhm.
we aren't upsetting the very people, the very relations that we live with. Every time I see a dead skunk that's been hit by a car, I think of that. I think about, even cats and dogs. I mean, they should have better relations for the ones who are like, there are some cats you cannot domesticate.
Right.
They just live in the alleys. There's not much we can do about that. But what can we do? We can get them fixed, and we can give them, access to roam in some capacity. And we don't allow that, right? We have very strict rules on everything. And I just wish when we talked about stewardship in general, that we just thought about creating communities different and working with the land instead of against it. And people who complain about, I don't know, whether it is skunks or raccoons or whatever, like understanding that this is something we have to learn how to work with. Up north, they've had to learn how to work with the polar bears. Just like we have snow days, sometimes you have polar bear days, and you don't get to go to school that day because there's polar bear roaming around until that's dealt with. And what does that mean too? Why do we kill bears?
Mm.
Like we kill bears without a thought. And so it's funny, I do wish we as a society would just stop and take a breath. And unfortunately, I don't want to see a nuclear war be the reason why we have to stop and take that breath, you know?
No, or a lack of water. Like, let's be clear, that's what a big
That's
part of
where we're
what we're
at.
facing. Yeah, we're facing potential water, our taps in Calgary, full stop, could full stop this year. It's not, hopefully they're managing it, but one, two, three wrong things that happen with this water main upgrade and we could be without water. And I think this is a moment for us to really recognize how all of these choices have amalgamated towards that. To your point about us being fussed about having wildlife in our yard, we had two bobcats in our yard last year, and it was so thrilling to see. But I just was looking around thinking, where are they going to go? Where are they going to land? And it's just, we've got a water shortage, and yet I haven't heard us talk about not mowing this year. I haven't heard us talk about planting native. This would all be creating habitat. And it would feel good. Like that's the other part of it, Michelle, is I really think that we are being held back from this beautiful future that you were posing as well, which is where we actually get to see wildlife thrive and come back and be a part of our lives. That's so interesting that they used to take caution with creating water for
Yeah.
other living beings when
Yeah.
they developed things. It seems like we have lost any sort of sense of those relationships when we make these decisions,
I do
roadways.
I want to kind of chime in about one thing here. When it comes to climate change, the denialism is really hurting people for the very reason that you talked about the water source that we get here in Calgary, up the glaciers, up the mountains. They're receding at a rate that's going to cause us to have no water. So, for folks to want to fight that and not understand the gravity of what climate change is, and I mean, I'm a Yellowknife Dene First Nation. My people were even further north, but because of the residential school, my granny was brought south and then assigned Yellowknife Dene after she got out of residential school. And so I should be up there, but because of the mining that has been done up there, the arsenic that's everywhere, why on earth would I be wanting to move back there when I know what's up there waiting for me. I know the silencing that they do up there. I know domestic violence is still rampant, and because there hasn't been proper infrastructure put in place, because unless people see economic reason to do it, they don't do it. So the mess that's been left up there by the mining companies is atrocious. There's no accountability. So, like, even as an Indigenous person from up north, I'm already an, environmental refugee. And
Right.
people don't understand that that's just going to continue. We're all
Yeah.
going to become refugees of the environment because if Calgary loses that water source from all those glaciers receding, then we're all environmental refugees.
Thank you. It's so critical for people to understand this. And as you were pointing to, the industry has it has to for the industrial system to continue growing, it has to impact us too. And you're very right to say the racism is a part of holding that facade over us. And again, as somebody who was in development, who was an extractivist by nature, we are isolated from that. So intentionally, we don't work with, we don't have those conversations. We don't have to have those conversations. Somebody else has those conversations on our behalf. And and then when I was behind the curtain, if you will, when I was working on this and actually working with the people that hold those conversations, that's where I could see the inherent racism behind it. I'll be specific. Sites, yeah, and you spoke about sexism too. The sites were presented as a beauty contest. I remember seeing a PowerPoint presentation that showed women lined up and were saying, "This is how we're choosing our sites to close." So there was the sexism, and then the racism that I saw was we would be talking about where we were going to work, which projects were the ones that we were going to clean up. And they would say, oh, well, it'll cost way too much to do anything in Indigenous communities. They'll want they'll want a cut, they'll want this or that. And so I would look at two projects. One would be outside of Indigenous communities and one would be within it. One would cost 100,000 per well. This one would only cost 75,000 per well. But we'd still say that that was somehow more expensive. And so it became very apparent to me that that was, if we prioritize the people who vote, the people who have money, the people who have the power, if we make sure that those sites are cleaned up and that they're looked after, they won't look and see this other bigger, huge problem that we're creating. And I think the capper for me when I finally came into this completely was to learn that 80% of Canada's critical habitats are within Indigenous territories.
Yeah.
So that's that right there. We're disproportionately blinded unless you grew up in those spaces and you lived on those spaces and you understand the history of those spaces being, well, I mean, Blood Nation has what, something like 3% native grassland left, something
Yeah.
like this.
Yeah.
So unless you know the history, I don't think you understand. And as you were pointing to in the 30s, the other thing was the farming, the tools that were given to Indigenous communities to farm were less capable of the tools that settlers used. And there was this disproportionate failure, which then led them to take over these lands, etc. So yeah,
And that is what's upsetting when I hear industry talking points. We're going to empower Indigenous people. It's like, hold up. We've never not been empowered. You've always put a boot on our neck at a certain point within the process somewhere.
right.
Always. It's
Yeah.
never been about empowering us. It's been about, can we ever have an equal footing? No. No, and that's the language they use to justify their policies that they've always imposed on us. And I do recommend the book Lost Harvests if you're interested in a little more about what Jenny was just talking about, where we would talk about farming and purposely putting these policies in place to stop people as well as clearing the plains. And if you can read those two books without crying, then I don't know if you have a heart.
Sure. Well, that's the other thing I think just to bring in for people. I talked about caribou in terms of keystone species, and you rightly said, what about the buffalo? Like there's a
Yeah,
keystone species that we completely removed from the landscape, not we settlers removed from the landscape, and people don't fully understand that. Like I went to riding on st or the Buffalo Jump
Yep.
last
Both.
year, and
Yep.
to see the pile of buffalo that were murdered by settlers across North America. How many, do you happen to remember how many?
I would have no idea. And again, I do think more about caribou only because that's where my people are. That was the keystone food and animal source of its time. That has been disrupted so much from industry. And as of yesterday, we got so many billions of dollars that apparently are going to continue upsetting our, keystone animals up there.
Yeah. So let's maybe switch into some things that we can do about this.
Sure.
How do we come together? How do we start repairing these things? And again, I'll offer my loose
Sure.
my thoughts about this. So I think number one, like you said, to acknowledge that environmentalism and treaties are one and the same. They are, if we are want to uphold the environment, if we want to have a healthy future, that is honoring the treaties, learning how to have a relationship with the land that serves us, but serves all the other species around us. The other thing I wanted to bring into this was just, I guess, the need to have conversations, like acknowledging that who's missing in conversations when we do have them. I often will look around and say, oh man, like we're still not having these overlapping conversations with Indigenous friends. And we're getting better, I will say. I mean, we're doing this, so this is a good sign.
Yep.
So I think just seeking out conversations and being humble with what that looks like, but also I think just being active participants in whatever initiative feels like it's bringing us together and being committed to, like you said, reading and understanding not only the history, but where we need to go. So that's again going back to this need to repair our relationships with the land. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. I'm sure I have more, but let you
Oh,
lead a little
sure.
bit.
No, I couldn't agree more. I just want to educate our listeners for 1 second on the United Nations Declaration of Rights of
Mm.
Indigenous Peoples. We've had folks from Treaty 7 and all of Alberta actually as some of the founding chiefs and leaders in that realm, creating an internationally known document. And I've said if that was anyone else, we'd have streets named after them, we'd have bridges named after them and such, but we don't because we don't want to acknowledge the incredible achievements that Indigenous people make because of our underlying racism. Now, the actual document itself really talks about the rights of the people who have been there since time immemorial to have rights over people who have not. And so there's an expression everyone knows, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But yet that was never applied to every other place on the planet. We don't follow the indigenous governance. We follow a Westminster colonial system that was imposed by Britain. And we see that as somehow Canadian. We are still part of the Commonwealth. If we are going to, so-called separate in any capacity, I think first you'd have to separate from the crown. But in order to do that, then you're breaking the international treaties that are recognized internationally as this is Indigenous land. So I would argue, as Indigenous people, we have allowed settlers to do their governance, to do their business in their ways, with the hope that maybe there would be an understanding that we have to work together and start doing things together, revenue sharing together. And that has never come to be. So I think that we need settlers to understand, to be honest, we really could kick y'all out and tell you to go home. And of course, you have no home because a lot of you have been here for how many generations? And we're not vindictive people. We're not like that at all. All we want is equality. That's literally it. We have so many reports I talk endlessly on my podcast about the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. It has 104 calls to prosperity that would actually put us on equal footing. Land back. It's a movement that would save the land. It would save us from climate change, but it would be a part of meaningful relationships, right? Meaningful reconciliation and allowing Indigenous people governance. A lot of people don't understand the Indian Act is not our governance. It was imposed by the Westminster British colonial system called Canada. It's not our system. So when we talk about going back to traditional governance, it's not a Westminster British system. It's a system that we had our ways. Now, unfortunately, we'd have to rebuild that because of the active participation and oppression that Canada has perpetuated for over 150 years out here, 400 out on the other side. I wish Albertans especially would learn about their history. I wish that for me, people can understand the solutions are there in these reports. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission talks about the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People as the foundation of how to rebuild our reconciliation journey. The 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit, it talks about domestic violence. It talks about violence, human trafficking, all the things we claim that we're, against having rampant. We'd actually just have to implement them. Now, I've ran both municipally and provincially. I've worked federally with the Liberals, and what I have found over the course of watching all of this is that the voters themselves are so uneducated on the Westminster colonial system. They're uneducated on the issues that we're facing. They're uneducated on the solutions that we're facing, and they are easily manipulated by politicians, unfulfilled promises that politicians give, and then they justify it with, well, this one's no better, this one's no better.
Mm.
If you really feel your politics is no better than nothing, why would you not allow Indigenous people a seat at the table or allow our system to take over? And it's that racism. So, I listen to Black voices as well. I think that there's a lot of learnings that we can do from Black voices. There was two Black academics in Chicago I talked to a long time ago when I first read this book called White Fragility. And they talked about racial battle fatigue. And I said to them, as a Native, are you comfortable with me using that term? And they said, my Indigenous sister, absolutely. And so I try to talk about how exhausting it is as an Indigenous person to hear terrible political takes, one from settlers about their own settler communities' politics, but also the regular assumptions and myths about Indigenous people and how exhausting that gets. When I talk about racial battle fatigue for women, and I say this to all women, you've been dismissed by a man just simply because you're a woman. It's that feeling, at times a billion, all the time. So if you are a Black or an Indigenous woman in this world, like I actually can't determine sometimes, is it because I have ADHD? Is it because I am a woman? Is it because I'm Indigenous that I'm so marginalized? But it's all of those things. The thing I've learned from the disability community is how bullies immediately know when somebody isn't there like them, and then they, out of fear, hurt them. That's just the basis of domestic violence, the basis of colonialism, the basis of racism, the basis of sexism and ableism, all of it. It's such a simple concept. And if this, little girl from Alberta could figure it out, I have faith everybody else can too.
Yeah, well, there's so much you said there, but I want to back up and say something that you said that I think is really important, is that our Alberta chiefs are leading the world in this. This is something that we have to, I think people step over what's happening here and not really understand the significance. And, I would say at the same time, simultaneously, our Alberta industrial leaders are misleading the world at the same time. So we have both things happening in this province. One is something beautiful that if we embrace and understand and get behind, we have a fabulous restorative future for all of us. And again, you mentioned the term land back, and a friend of mine was saying we should talk about this term, but I'm going to try and label it in a way that I think is palatable for most people, which is going back to this land stewardship laws. This is about honoring what function of the ecology we need. So when I think about land back, doing it well, doing it right, it is looking at the ecology and saying what parts need to function well, and do we need to get out of the way in order for them to do it. So that to me is the best way to think from a Western perspective about land back. Again, not where, okay, everybody, Cougar Ridge, pack your bags, you're out of here. Because what does that do for
Nothing.
solving anything?
Yeah.
Um,
And that's not in any, that's like a retribution that we've never come to. And to me, it's actually more about governance than it is anything. So for a lot of folks, you may not know, but the way the reservations or the reserves were imposed through the Indian Act is that we have access to like 0.01% of the land. Now, the majority of it's so-called crown land. So even if we had the rights to be able to govern what's considered crown land for now, um, that could restore a lot of the ecosystems. Like, imagine if we actually did. We do have a buffalo treaty. There are a lot of scientists who know and understand that by restoring a keystone species like the buffalo would restore a lot of the ecology of this area. So a lot of settlers have signed the Buffalo Treaty and have worked with the indigenous communities to try to start bringing back the buffalo in a way so that we can all live together. Now, as a person who has traveled up to Yellowknife a few times in her life, I can promise you we can work with the buffalo and drive up and down highways with the buffalo. I promise it can happen. Now, I would like to see more land bridges, me personally, because I don't like seeing deer, skids on the road and such. But at the same time, like these are conversations we should be having about how to start working with the land better and listening together. I grew up watching Dr. David Suzuki, and I think that you as a geoscientist have a lot to offer and can work collaboratively with Indigenous people. And I think all settlers are starting to understand that. I was even having a conversation with an astronomist about how he's starting to listen to Indigenous perspective of the stars. We call it the star people, and having relations with something that we have to have relations with, whether or not we like it, we have to. So it's understanding you have to work with what you have. And that's how we want to do. And we need to start to be heard and listened to. But and racism really stops and prevents that. And until the settlers can see that, unfortunately, we may just bypass you together and just like we're going to take that Westminster system and throw it out the window. Now, I've always felt if the Senate was just filled with Indigenous people, we could have meaningful conversation and we could have, that proper amendments being done through the Westminster system. But again, we have the right actually to just throw it out and say, sorry, guys, you had 150 years. We're going to do it this way now.
Well, and it's just so funny. Like you said, we keep complaining about left and right politics or center politics and all these leaders all being corrupt and doesn't matter what party it is. Maybe it's the system, folks. Maybe it's the system that allows this power structure to exist. I want to plug up one other book because it was very meaningful for my um, journey. And it was a Black author in the States who was an economist. She wrote The Sum of Us. And one of the things she talked about is the fact that to have and thinking, to think more abundantly, is anti-racism. So it's the moment that we get out of this zero sum thinking and understand that there's space for both you and me and everyone else to thrive. Wow, the sky's the limit. So I think there's
100%.
just such a huge opportunity for us to meet our full potential by trying to forget about these labels and these potential barriers to our collaboration. I'm so thrilled you and I are finally in conversation, Michelle. I'm looking forward to more of these. I hope we can do some more of these. Yeah, what any other closing words you wanted to offer?
I just really do want to encourage people. I want to meet you where you're at. I know not everybody loves to read. Audiobooks exist, podcasts exist. There are a lot of YouTube channels that have a lot of information from Indigenous academics, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous elders in general. The information is out there if you're willing to seek it. Now, if you only care about ghost stories, I promise we have a whole bunch of that as well. But if you're really serious about meaningful reconciliation when it comes to climate change and ecology in general, we have tons of folks doing that great work. And locally, we have the ancestral podcast, science podcast, like so. Whatever your niche interest is, I promise you, we have a podcast or we have YouTube channels or whichever that we have that common ground that we can work together. And I hope that we start seeing each other as neighbors because like I have an immigrant stepmom. I fought Stephen Harper on that Omar Khadr bill because I didn't want to see my half brother being shipped to Austria, a place he's never been. Like we have lots of people we love that are, my dad is white, point blank. I'm not wanting to ship you all home. I want to learn my language. And the money it took in order to create the residential school system easily could be put into helping us reclaim our language because you know what, our languages actually help us with the environment because it helps us understand how to talk about the land from a different point of view and dismantle patriarchy. I know that might be a little too much for some of our listeners, but
Yes, well, that's a whole other conversation we could
yeah,
certainly talk about. But yeah, the other thing, one more thing to plug, the Indigenous Canada course was extremely useful for me, especially when you think about justice in a from an Indigenous perspective. That was mind blowing. So I
Mhm.
highly encourage people. That's a free course that's offered by the U of A. It's excellent. So if you want to look into that. But yeah, we have lots more to talk about, Michelle. I'm super thrilled to be learning from you, to be in conversation with you. And I can't
Vice
believe how much
versa.
of a history. Now it makes sense why you say we've seen each other in the past. I'm so bad with realizing people from one group to another. It's crazy to me to think that you were in the seismic world too. We have a lot of overlap.
And I would have just been that young tech that's in the office that never seen outside windows, right? Like, talk about I should have figured out I had autism or ADHD a little sooner. Like, would be so easily happy doing the simplest things like that. But I obviously when you become a mom, you have to change, but the systemic racism, that's what it was. And I was like, I have to really unpack that. Anyway, we could talk forever. It was
We
wonderful
could.
getting to know you this way, and I'm
Yeah.
so grateful to be on your podcast, and I appreciate you being on mine.
Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. We'll do this again. Take care for now.
Okay, take care.